They told her the house would kill her children, the men who drew lines on paper, who had never once felt the cold rise up through the ground beneath their boots, called it primitive, unhealthy, a thing to be torn down and left behind. And they put her name at the top of the list, first. But out beyond the frozen river, the cold was already teaching a different lesson. Their proper timber walls were cracking apart at the seams, frost climbing the inside of them like white feathers, and the low house of earth they laughed at held. A widow stood alone on its roof in a wind that had killed a horse in her own yard. One post inside was already dying. One child was already coughing, and a stranger with a broken leg lay on her floor, carrying, in a leather case, the one thing that could save them all, or bury them. She had one winter, and the ground was iron. The wind came down out of the north in the last hard week of the cold season, and it did not stop for anything living. It crossed 1,000 miles of open grass without touching a single hill tall enough to slow it down. By the time it reached the narrow bend of the frozen river, where a small cluster of low houses sat hunched against the earth, it carried a cold that did not belong to the season yet. The houses were built into the ground itself, half sunk, rounded, covered over with sod and packed mud, so that from a distance they looked like the backs of sleeping animals bedded down against a storm. Smoke rose from their roofs in thin gray threads, and bent sideways the moment it left the earth. A yellow dog crossed the packed dirt between two of the houses. It lifted one paw off the frozen ground, and would not set it down again. At the base of the largest house, a horse lay on its side in the hard mud. Its eye was open. The eye had frozen open sometime in the night, and a thin skin of ice sealed the dark of it, so that the horse seemed to be watching the gray sky without blinking. It had been a good horse the evening before, a healthy horse. What killed it was not sickness. What killed it was the air. The air had reached down into its lungs and turned them into something the animal could no longer use. Inside the largest house, a woman was grinding corn. Her name was Della Hartwell. She was 34 years old that winter, and she moved her shoulders in a rhythm older than the country outside her door, back and forth, stone on stone. The same motion her mother had used, and her mother's mother before that, going back further than anyone in that place could count. She had not yet seen the horse. She did not yet know that a rider was already crossing the last low ridge toward her door, carrying a folded paper with her name written at the top. Della wore a dress the color of pale clay, and a heavy robe pulled tight across her shoulders. Her hair was black and long enough to sit on, though she had cut 2 fingers' length of it that autumn, and laid it in her mother's grave. Her face was neither soft nor hard. It was the face of a woman who had already learned what a winter costs, and was doing the sums in her head about the price of the next one. Because there was a price. There was always a price. Her mother had built this house with her own hands in a warmer year, with the help of many neighbors and a feast that fed the whole valley for 2 days. That was how a house was raised in that place, not with coin, with labor, with the hands of others, paid in food and hide and gratitude. But her mother was gone now. She had died at the end of the warm season, of a sickness that had no name. And the last thing she had said, in a voice already turning to wind, was about the center post, the great post that held the whole roof. She had said it had one more winter in it. One, and no more. That was the inheritance, not the garden plots along the river, which were good, not the storage pits beneath the floor, full of dried squash and beans and pounded meat, not the standing in the valley, which was considerable. The true inheritance was a countdown, a single winter in which to become the woman her mother had been, or watch the roof come down on her children while they slept beneath it. Della set down the grinding stone. She looked at the 4 posts that stood around the low fire like witnesses at a trial. East, south, west, north. Her eyes touched each of them in the order her mother had taught her. The east post had a hairline crack running down from the fork. She had seen it. She had said nothing. The north post was the one that frightened her. In the last week it had begun to weep a fine dark sap from a knot the size of a walnut. And the sap was not the sap of a living tree. It was the sap of a tree that had been dead for many winters, and had finally been asked to hold up more weight than it could remember how to carry. Her daughter looked up from the far side of the fire. Wren, 11 years old, small hands already moving on a second grinding stone, in the rhythm her grandmother had taught her before the sickness came. Grandmother said the north post talks in its sleep, the girl offered. Not as a joke, as a piece of information she had been carrying, and did not know what else to do with. Della knelt beside her. She took a handful of the ground meal and tested it between her thumb and finger for grit. She said many things, Della answered. She said you would know when it was time. The girl's hands did not stop moving, and Della watched her own daughter do the work her own mother had done, and felt, for the first time in 2 months, something that was not quite grief. It was closer to the narrow attention of a hunter when the light begins to change. Her son sat too close to the fire. Silas, 6 years old. He had been told to move back without a word being spoken, only a look. He moved back. He was that kind of child. He watched everything and complained about none of it. Then, from outside, came the sound of hooves, not the light step of a valley horse. Something heavier, slower, iron shoes on frozen mud, coming from the east. Della rose without hurry. She had known this visit was coming since the last leaves fell from the ash trees along the river. She had only not known which day. Now she knew. The man who came was named Cordell. He worked for the company, the one that drew lines on maps and expected the land to obey them. He was not a cruel man, and that made him more dangerous than a cruel man would have been. A cruel man could be met with clean anger. This one could only be met with patience. And patience in a winter like that one cost more than most families had left to spend. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw her. He did not smile. Mrs. Hartwell. His breath came out in a plume that hung between them like a small ghost. The company asked me to bring word ahead of the worst of the cold. I would rather have brought other word. I did not choose the word I was given. She waited. She had learned early that the second thing such a man said was usually closer to the truth than the first. By spring, he went on, and now he was looking somewhere past her shoulder, at the mud roof, at the thin bent thread of smoke. The valley is to be cleared. Every family moved to timber houses the company is raising downriver. Milled lumber, iron stoves. He paused. It is the company's position that these earth houses are unhealthy, that the people would be better off in walls of a more proper kind. Unhealthy. She turned the word over in her mind without speaking it. In 3 winters in this house, she had lost her husband to a fever that came upriver on other men's breath. She had lost her mother to a sickness that followed the same road. Neither of them had died because of the shape of the walls they lived in. They had died because of what walked in through the door. And this man, whose company fed him from the same road that had carried those breaths, was telling her that the roof over her head was the problem. She said none of it. She said only the list. Yes. Whose name is at the top of the list? He hesitated, and in the hesitation, she had her answer before he gave it. Yours, he said. Yours. And the 2 children. The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the valley, a woman was singing a low song for the boy's dead horse, not for anyone listening, the way a person sings when the singing is only for herself. Della let the song into her chest, and then let it out again. "Thank you for the courtesy of the warning," she said, in an English so precise it embarrassed him, which had been part of what she intended. "There is warm food in my cousin's house, and grain for your horse. Take what you need. Then ride back before the second wind rises." She looked past him to the flat gray west. "It will rise before dark." He took the food, because to refuse would have insulted her more than accepting, and she watched him walk his horse away between the houses, and she understood that in his mind, the visit was already finished. The paper had already moved past her name, to the next one on the sheet. Della climbed to the roof of her mother's house. She stood there in the killing wind, and she looked west, at the flat brown grass rolling on without end. She looked down at the horse with a frozen eye. Some family had loved that animal. Some child would cry for it before the day was out. And the same air that had emptied its lungs in a single night was the air her son was breathing right now, 6 feet below her, under a roof that would not last the season. She looked at the thin thread of smoke bending sideways above her own house, above her sleeping son, above her working daughter, above the weeping north post, and she began to do the sums every woman in her line had done for longer than anyone could remember. The number in the air was far below nothing, but the number in the ground, 6 feet down, where the old warmth still lived, that number was still enough to keep a child alive. The distance between those 2 numbers was the distance between her family in the spring and her family gone. She did not weep. She had not wept for her mother. She was not going to begin on a roof in the wind. She only stood there, a widow alone against a sky the color of a blade laid flat, and made a decision that no woman in the memory of anyone still breathing in that valley had ever made. She would build a new house. She would build it in winter, when the ground was iron and the wood was frozen through, and every reason in the world said it could not be done. She would build it anyway, because the post her mother swore would last 1 winter had already begun to die, and because somewhere out on that frozen river, closer than she knew, a stranger was about to fall through the last thin hours of his own story and land, broken and half frozen, right in the middle of hers. That afternoon, her uncle came to see her. Old Amos was the keeper of the old ways for that stretch of the valley. He had been keeping them since before Della was born. He walked with a limp he never explained. He wore around his neck a string of dark beads and one small piece of polished bone that he was not in the habit of explaining either. He came into her mother's house without announcing himself. As her mother's brother, he had never needed to. He sat down on the north side of the fire, which was where a man of his standing sat. And he did not speak for a long time. Della waited. She had learned patience at this man's knee. She knew that the old ones did not rush toward the hard thing. They circled it, the way a hawk circles a field before it drops. Wren brought him a bowl of corn and dried squash. He accepted it. He ate 2 mouthfuls. He set it down. His hands on the bowl were the hands of a man who had once bent iron with his fingers and had never quite lost the memory of the strength. "I had a dream," he said at last. She kept her face still. In her family, the dreams of this old man were not decorations. "The 4 posts," he said. They closed their eyes, all 4, not one by one, together. He looked into the fire, not at her. In the dream, I asked them, "What is this closing?" And they did not answer, because a post that has closed its eyes cannot speak. He picked the bowl up again. He ate slowly. So I asked the fire, and the fire said, "The woman must not raise a new post this winter, not next spring, not the summer after that." He set the bowl down. "She must wait until the 4th summer. And even then, she must ask twice before she cuts." Della's hands did not move. Her voice, when she found it, was as level as the surface of still water. "Uncle, the North Post weeps," my mother said one winter. "Your mother said many things." He looked at her then, and his eyes were not unkind, and that was somehow worse. "She said this thing last. A dream is not a preference, daughter of my sister. A dream is not a fear. I did not choose it. I would have preferred another one." He rose. He set the bowl down. He touched the top of Silas's head in passing, a gesture so brief and so full of tenderness that Della had to look away. And then he ducked through the low entrance and was gone. She sat for a long time after he left. The fire did what fires do. Wren went back to the corn without being asked, and Silas, who had watched the whole exchange without a sound, crawled over and put his head against his mother's knee. His hair smelled of smoke and river mud and something else she could not name, something that was only him. She did not name it, because to name it would be to admit that a mother notices these things, the way she notices a change in the weather, and the weather was already telling her more than she wanted to know. She looked at the North Post while the children settled for the night, at the dark bead of sap weeping from the knot in its side. Her mother had raised this house in a good year, a warm year, a year when there were many hands to help, and a feast to feed them, and a song for each of the 4 directions when the roof was finished. Her mother had stood on that finished roof and sung. Della had never sung it. She had never thrown the feast, never hired the hands, never stood on a roof of her own making and bound a house to the 4 directions with her own voice. Her mother had always done it. And now her mother was a grave on the low bluff, with 2 fingers' length of her daughter's hair laid in beside her. That was the shape of the thing. A woman who had never built, asked to build the impossible in the season when building could not be done. She banked the fire low, and she did not sleep well. The next evening, her cousin came. Marta was younger than Della, married to a man who was gone most of the year on the far trails with his brothers, mother of 3 children of her own, none of whom favored her. In that valley, the land passed through the mother's line, and what that meant, in plain terms, was that Marta had a claim, a distant one, on any garden plot that fell empty in Della's family. Everyone knew it. No one had ever said it out loud. Marta came in with a small pouch of dried plums, which was the correct thing to bring. She sat on the south side of the fire, which was the correct place to sit, and she began to speak of small things. The deer had gone up to the high ground earlier than usual this year. The ice on the shallows had already thickened past the point where a child could safely walk on it. Della let her speak. Because she had known this cousin since before either of them could stand upright, and she knew that the small things were only the sound a person makes, while working up to the large one. At last, the large one came. Uncle told me his dream, Marta said. She did not meet Della's eyes, and the not meeting was itself a message. He tells me his dreams sometimes. He says I have a face that holds a secret quietly. Della said nothing. It was not true that Marta held secrets quietly. It was true that the old man told her his dreams. Both things were part of the arrangement. If you cannot build, Marta said, the plots by the river will need someone to hold them. I am only saying what everyone will say. I am saying it early, so you hear it from me first, cousin. Which is a kindness. It is, Della agreed, and the agreement cost her nothing, because it was, in fact, a kind of kindness. The kind a knife is, when it is sharpened before it is used. They sat in silence for a while. The fire cracked once, a small sound, like a knuckle. You have 2 children, Marta said, softer now. You have no husband to raise a beam with you. You have an old man telling you the dream says no. And you have a winter outside that has already killed a horse in your own yard. I know what I have. I know you do. Marta rose at the mouth of the tunnel. She paused. That is what frightens me, cousin. You always know what you have, and you always spend it all. Then she said, the company man came today. He did. He named you. He did. Marta nodded once, slowly, and she left. Della sat with the pouch of plums in her lap. She did not eat one. She sat with 2 sentences laid side by side in the dark. Her mother had said the post had 1 winter in it. Her mother had also said she would know when it was time. Those 2 sentences, set next to each other, were not a comfort. They were an appointment. The days after that ran together in her memory, ever after, like beads whose string had loosened. But she always knew it was that same hard week when her daughter came in from the river carrying something in her arms, something Della, in the first half-second, mistook for a wounded calf. It was too large, it was too pale, and it was making a sound that no calf ever made. Wren was crying and not crying at the same time. A state Della recognized because she had been in it herself many times. He was on the ice, the girl said, in a voice smaller than her mother had ever heard from her. He was talking to no one. His leg is wrong. The thing in her daughter's arms was not a calf. It was a man, a stranger, perhaps 40 years old, pale brown hair, cut in the way of the men who came from the far settlements, a beard 4 days grown, a mouth cracked and bleeding at both corners. His right leg was dark with blood, and beneath the wool, when Della cut it away with the small knife at her belt, the bone of his shin was bent at an angle no living leg was ever meant to make. His pulse was fast and shallow. His skin, where it showed, had already begun to take on the waxy look that comes just before the cold does its worst work. But it had not passed the line. Not yet. He had been out there a matter of hours, no more. And over one shoulder he carried a leather case on a strap. He was still carrying it when he fell. His fingers were curled around it in a grip that had not let go, even when everything else in him had. She should have refused him. Every rule she had been raised on told her to refuse him. Her uncle would tell her to refuse him. Her cousin, if she saw, would carry the news downriver before the man even woke. The last stranger who had slept in this house had left a fever behind that killed her husband. The one before that had left a fever that killed her mother. There was nothing in her body's memory that argued for taking this one in. Nothing. But she saw the case. She saw the leather case, and something in her mind, which had been turning over numbers for days without stopping, added a column she had not known was on the page. "Help me," she said to Wren. They dragged him inside. He was heavier than he looked. They laid him on the low platform on the west side of the house, her mother's platform, empty since the end of the warm season. She sent Silas to bring a length of green willow and 2 strips of tanned hide, and she set the leg herself, without softness, because softness now would only cost him more, later. He made a sound during the setting that was not a scream, and was not a word. And then he was quiet again. She wrapped the leg in the willow splint. She bound it tight. She pulled a robe up over him. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at his face for a long moment. He was not handsome. He was not ugly. He was a man, and he was here. And she had taken him in. And now the only question left was what to do with the fact that she had. She reached across his sleeping body, and without hurry, she unbuckled the strap of the leather case. Inside were 2 things. The first was a folded map, a map of the whole river valley, drawn to a finer scale than any she had ever seen, marked with the small, careful notes of a man trained to see land the way a butcher sees a hog. A pencil line ran across it, east to west, and along that line, at even distances, were stake marks. She did not have to be able to read every word to understand what a line like that meant. A road, a great iron road, planned to run through this exact stretch of the valley. The line did not go around the cluster of low houses. It went straight through them, straight through her floor. The second thing in the case was a sheet of paper, folded into quarters. Beneath a printed heading she could not read was a list, family names arranged in columns, dates written beside them in a tight clerk's hand, removal dates, and at the top of the second column, in ink that had not fully dried before the paper was folded, was her own name. She read the list once for the fact of it, and once more, slowly, for the record she would keep in her body for the rest of her life. Then she folded the paper along its own creases. She put it back in the case. She buckled the strap, and she laid it beside the sleeping man, and pulled the robe higher on his chest, so he would not lose more heat than he already had. She would not turn him out. She had known that from the moment she saw the case, because a dead stranger found on the ice, was worth nothing to her. His masters would only send another one in the spring. But a living stranger, with a mended leg, who owed a woman his warmth. That was a different creature entirely. A living man could be spoken to. A living man could be kept. It was not mercy. She could not afford mercy. It was the coldest kind of counting. And the counting was her mother's. Feed the man. Mend the leg. Hold the map. Her uncle would not agree. Her cousin would carry the news downriver inside a week. The company man would come back. She had that long, perhaps less, to decide what she wanted from the stranger on the platform, and to be far enough along in the wanting that when they asked her to give him up, she had already made him worth more to her than he was to them. She banked the fire. She sent the children to their platforms, and she lay down on her own, not to sleep. She had known since the wind changed that she would not sleep that night. She lay down only to close her eyes, and let her mother's voice, which she still heard sometimes at the edge of things, say the thing it had said at the end, that the North Post had one winter in it, and no more. And that she would know when it was time. She knew now. It was time. The stranger woke on the second day. He surfaced slowly, out of a fever that had held him under, and opened his eyes on a ceiling of woven willow he did not recognize. He did not speak at first. He looked at the willow. He looked at the fire. He looked at the woman sitting on the far side of it, grinding corn, not looking at him, and he had the sense, even weak as he was, to stay quiet and let her be the one to begin. She let him wait a long time. Then she said, without turning her head, "Your leg is set. It will heal if you do not move on it. If you move on it, it will heal crooked, and you will limp the rest of your life. That is your choice. Not mine." He was quiet a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet." She turned then and looked at him fully for the first time since he had woken. "I went into your case," she said. "I read the map. I read the list." His throat moved. He did not look away. She took note of that. "My name is on the list," she said. "At the top, beside a date. So before I decide what to do with you, you are going to tell me who you are, and you are going to tell me what a man carrying that map was doing on the ice, 5 miles above these houses, in the worst part of the cold." He was silent for a count she measured by her own pulse in her ears, and she waited. Because he was not a man deciding whether to lie. He was a man deciding which truth would cost him the least. She knew that hesitation from the inside. She had worn it herself, days before, with the company man at her door. He drew a breath. "My name is Elias Reed," he said. "I am a field engineer. I survey land. I find the best path for a road, and I mark it. And I send my markings back to the men who pay me. It is a step above what I trained for. It carries a good wage, a title on the letterhead, and a set of instruments the company would very much like returned. The road on the map. The road on the map. It runs through my house. It runs through a great many houses." He said it quietly, not as an excuse, as a fact he was ashamed of. "This valley is only one line on one page to the men who drew it. They have never stood in it. They have never felt the cold in the ground. They see a river and a straight distance, and they draw." "And the list," she said. "The names, the dates. The list is a copy. There are others. My orders this season were to go out ahead and confirm on the ground that these houses would be empty by the time the work began. To be certain, the line, as drawn, could be built. He stopped there. He had answered the hardest part of her question by answering the easiest, and he knew he had. And he was giving her a moment to hold what he had handed her. She held it. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you rode ahead of the men who would move us, on purpose, to be sure we would be gone." "I am telling you I rode ahead," he said. "Yes, and you lost your way. My party lost me in a squall, 3 days before your daughter found me." He paused. "I did not turn back toward them. I let the horse choose the way, and the horse chose the river." She did not laugh, but something moved in her chest that was close to it. In the language of her people, there was a saying that a man who blames his horse for a decision is a man who made the decision himself and does not want to sign his name to it. She heard the shape of that saying in his plain words. "You let the horse choose," she said. "I let the horse choose." And what do you think the horse was choosing, Mr. Reed? A warm fire? Or a way out of a life you had stopped being able to live? He was quiet a long time. "I do not know yet," he said finally. "I do not know what I am, lying here. I only know that I walked away in a storm, and I did not walk back." She studied him. Outside, a raven called once above the smoke hole and flew on. "You have said a great deal," she said at last. "I believe some of it. I am not yet certain which part." "Until I am certain, you will stay on that platform. You will eat what my daughter brings you. You will not touch the case again." She rose. "And if the company man comes back before I have decided, you will not make a sound. You will be a shadow under a robe. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," he said. Then, very quietly, "I have signed my name to worse arrangements than this one." She paused at the mouth of the tunnel. She did not turn back. "My son is 6 years old," she said. "My daughter is 11. If that line is not moved, they will be sleeping in a timber shed downriver by the first hard frost of next winter. And the first fever that comes up the river will take one of them. Likely my son. He is smaller. He has always been slower to shake off a cold." She let that sit in the smoke between them. "That is what your case means in this house. I am telling you, so that when you sit there and reckon what you owe, you reckon it against the right number." And she went out into the cold. Over the days that followed, the arrangement between them began, without either of them naming it, to shift. It shifted slowly. It shifted in small things. He healed. By the third day, he could sit up against a rolled robe without pain. By the fourth, he could rest his weight briefly on the good leg. And he watched her, not the way a man watches a woman, the way a man watches something he is trying to understand and cannot. He watched Wren carry water and grind corn and lash willow, and never once complain. He watched Silas feed small sticks into the fire, one at a time, with the seriousness of a boy who has understood that the adults around him are doing something they are not certain they can do, and that his part is to be a person they do not have to worry about while they do it. And he watched Della draw a plan of the new house on a scraped piece of hide. He watched her measure the width of the floor with a knotted cord. And on the third evening, he asked if he might see the plan. She hesitated. Then she brought it to him. He looked at it for a long time in the firelight. "How deep do you mean to dig the floor?" he asked. She told him. "And how do you calculate the load of the roof against the length of the rafters?" She looked at him. "I do not calculate it in figures," she said. "I calculate it in the memory of every house in my line that has stood and every one that has fallen. And the memory says the rafters will carry the load if the fork of the center post cradles the beam, and the willow runs 3 fingers thick across the whole span." He was quiet. Then, carefully, because he had already learned that offering her his tools was the fastest way to lose her. "I could put that in numbers," he said, "not to correct it, to confirm it. If your mother's memory says 3 fingers of willow at that span will hold the weight of the sod at the peak, I can tell you whether the figures agree." He paused. "I would like them to agree. If they do, then you have both, the memory and the proof." She considered him for a long moment. He was offering her the one thing he had that she did not, the discipline that had earned him his living, the cold, careful counting of a man trained to trust nothing he could not measure. And he was offering it, not against her mother's knowledge, but underneath it, to hold it up. "Show me the number," she said. "If it says what my mother said, we will use both. If it disagrees, we will find out which of you is wrong. Before I cut anything, I cannot uncut." He worked it over the next 3 evenings, with a stub of pencil on the back of the printed list, because that paper was already hers now, in the private accounting she kept, and it seemed right that its blank side should be put to some better use. He measured. He figured. He crossed things out and began again. Some nights he worked until the fire was low and his eyes would not stay open, and Wren would take the pencil gently from his hand and set it aside, the way she might for a younger child. And on the 3rd night, he set the pencil down and looked at Della across the fire. "They agree," he said. There was something almost like wonder in his voice. "The lattice will hold. The rafters will carry. The 4 posts at the widths you drew. They are within a hair of what I would call the best possible load. Your mother was right. By feel. To a margin no engineer alive would have improved on." Della did not thank him. She only nodded once. But that night, she moved the leather case from beside his platform to beneath her own. And it was the first sign either of them had that something between them was beginning to turn. The cold, meanwhile, was doing its own work in the valley. And it was teaching a lesson that the woman's people had always known. And the men who drew lines on maps had never once believed. Downriver, past the bend, stood the first of the timber houses the company had raised. The proper houses, the healthy ones, the ones with milled walls and iron stoves, built by men who called the earth houses primitive, and meant it as a plain fact, not an insult. Those timber houses were losing heat through their walls faster than their stoves could make it. The straight sawn boards had shrunk in the cold and pulled apart at the seams. The wind came through the gaps like water through a torn net. Frost climbed the inside of the walls in white feathers by morning. And the earth houses, the low, round, sunken houses that the company was so eager to be rid of, did what they had always done. They held. The wind came down and found nothing to catch on. It slid over their rounded backs and continued on south and left the warmth inside untouched. Inside Della's house, the fire burned low and steady. The children slept. The stranger slept. And the cold that was cracking good timber apart downriver could not reach past the packed earth and the woven willow and the old, deep warmth that lived beneath the floor. The thing they called primitive was the thing that kept her children breathing. She thought about that in the long hours when she did not sleep. She thought about the men who had never stood in the valley, drawing their straight line through her floor. She thought about how certain they were, how certain a man could be, about a thing he had never once felt in the soles of his feet. She had lived her whole life being told that the old way was the poor way, the backward way, the way that people left behind when they learned better. And now the men who knew better were downriver, watching frost climb their proper walls, while her fire burned low and warm, and her children slept sound beneath a roof of earth. She did not feel triumph in it. Triumph was a luxury, and she had none to spare, but she felt something steadier than triumph. She felt certain. For the first time since her mother had died, she felt certain that the thing she carried in her hands and her body and her memory was worth carrying, was worth passing on, was worth building one more time, even in a winter that said it could not be done. And then, on the 5th day, Silas began to cough. It was a small thing at first, a dry cough. The kind a child gets from breathing too much smoke off a green fire. She told herself that was all it was. She told herself that 3 times a day, but she had been raised to feel for the truth in the body of a thing the way she felt for warmth in the ground. And somewhere beneath the part of her that was still telling itself a comfortable story, another part had already gone very still. Because she had heard a cough like that before. She had heard it in her husband. She had heard it in her mother. It came up river on the boats. It came out of the far settlements on the breath of men who did not know they carried it. And once it was in a house, there was no earth deep enough to bury yourself under to escape it. She said nothing. She fed the fire. She ground the corn. She checked the stranger's leg and drew her plans on the hide. And she walked out to the frozen rise where the new house would stand, and pressed her palm flat against the earth in 9 different places, feeling for the one spot that was warm. 2 of the 9 were right. She chose the one closer to the river, and behind her, faint on the cold air, from the low house where her son lay wrapped in robes, came that small, dry cough. Again and again. And every time it came, she did not turn her head. She only closed her eyes for the length of a single breath, and then opened them again and went back to the work, because the work was the only prayer she had left. And the reckoning of that winter, which had started as a countdown on a single dying post, had just added a number she did not yet know how to carry. The company man did not wait a full turning of the moon. He came in 9 days. By then, the new house was still only a deepening pit in the frozen rise, and a plan drawn on scraped hide. The frame would not go up for days yet. There was nothing on that ground a searcher could have pointed to and named. And the stranger was not hidden there. He was hidden in the old house, in the small pit at the southeast corner of the floor, the one that had held dried squash and a bundle of mint only a week before. Della had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, carefully, ahead of time. She had prepared in truth for the chance that Cordell would come back with more men than before. And when she saw him ride up over the eastern rise with only 2 behind him, she took it for the small mercy it was. The riders drew up at the outer ring of houses in the middle of a pale afternoon. The sky was the color of a blade laid flat. Cordell dismounted alone. His 2 men stayed on their horses. He walked the length of the settlement toward Della's house without looking at any of the women watching him from the low roofs. She met him at the mouth of the tunnel. She did not invite him in. She stood at the entrance, robe wrapped tight, hands folded in front of her, and she let the silence sit between them, because a silence broken by the visitor is a silence in which the visitor has already admitted he is the one who came uninvited. Mrs. Hartwell. His voice was tired. He had ridden hard. I have been told there is a man in your house who does not belong to your house. You have been told a great deal on the road then. She did not blink. Some of it will be true. Some of it is what people say when a widow keeps 3 garden plots, and a cousin does not. He did not smile, but something moved at the corner of his mouth, and she understood, in that flicker, that Cordell disliked Marta about as much as she did, and had not enjoyed being sent on the errand her words had earned him. It was useful. She filed it away. I am obliged to search the house, he said. You are obliged to try. She stepped aside from the tunnel. And I am obliged to let you, because I am a widow of no standing in your company's book, and refusing you would only send you back with 10 men instead of 2. She held his eyes. Do it quickly. My son is sleeping. He has been coughing. That last was true. It was also aimed, because Cordell, whatever else he was not the kind of man who enjoyed pulling a robe off a sick child. He ducked into the tunnel. He searched. He was thorough, without being cruel. He looked under the platforms. He looked into the storage pit at the north end of the floor, which Della had opened for him before he could ask. He looked along the willow racks on the west wall. He did not look at the second pit, because 3 nights before, Della had taken up the floorboards over it. She had laid down a fresh layer of packed earth, and over that, a woven mat of the kind used beneath grinding stones, and she had set the grinding stones on top of the mat, exactly where a woman would keep them. The seams were invisible, even to her in daylight, and beneath that mat, in the dark, Elias Reed lay flat on his back, breathing through his mouth, slow as a man can breathe, wrapped in a single robe against the cold that pressed up through the frozen earth all around him. Cordell stood in the middle of the house. He looked at the 4 posts. He looked at the east post, at the crack running down from its fork. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at Della. You are aware, he said, and he pitched his voice low enough that the men outside could not hear it, that hiding a company man is a thing I can treat, at my own discretion, as either a misunderstanding or a serious matter. I have been given wide room in what I choose to see, and what I choose to write down. I am aware. The man in question has been missing 11 days. His party turned back when he did not rejoin them. His employer has not yet reported it to anyone with a badge, because his employer would prefer to find him alive, and quietly. He waited. She said nothing. He was carrying documents, Cordell went on, carefully. The property of the company, they have not been recovered. He let that hang. Mrs. Hartwell, if those documents were, hypothetically, in this house, and if they were returned to me today, then I would be in a position to write that my search found nothing, that the rumor which sent me was a family quarrel of no interest to anyone above me. She looked at him for a long moment, and she saw the whole shape of the trade he was laying out on the frozen floor between them. Return the map, return the list, and the house goes unsearched from now on, and her name goes, if not off the paper, at least to the very bottom of it, and she buys her children another season by the very same currency that had been used against her. She almost took it. For one long breath, she almost took it. Then she thought of the pencil line running straight through her floor. She thought of the number Elias had written on the back of that paper, the number that agreed with her mother. She thought of what a living man who had walked away from his own road in a storm was worth to her, and what a folded paper was worth back in a company man's hand. And the counting came out the way she had known it would. Mr. Cordell, she said, I understand what you are offering. I decline it. His jaw tightened. I have no documents, she said. I have no company man. I have a coughing child and a cracked post and a moon that fills in 6 days. And I am a widow who was told at the start of this cold that her name sits at the top of a list, which I will assume you know as much about as I do. She stepped closer to him, just slightly. When that paper is found, if it is found, I hope it is found in a way that does not ask me to explain to my daughter why her mother sold a piece of her grandmother's memory to buy one more winter. She held his eyes. Please leave now. Your horse is standing in the cold. He looked at her for a long, long moment, and behind his eyes moved something that was not quite respect and not quite regret, and was, perhaps, a little of both. Then he nodded once, and he left. The 3 horses went east along the river trail at a walk until they were 3 small marks against the pale grass. And only then did she climb down. Only then, with Wren's help, did she lift the grinding stones off the woven mat and pry up the packed earth and pull Elias Reed out of the cold pit that had very nearly become his grave. He was blue at the lips. His hands would not close when she put them near the fire. It took 2 hours to bring him back. He did not thank her, and she was grateful for that, because a word of thanks in that hour would have asked her to say a thing she was not ready to say, that she had chosen him over the trade, over the safe road, over one more certain season for her children, and that the choosing had not, in the end, been entirely for his sake. The next day, Silas was worse. The cough had turned in the night. It had gone from dry to wet, from small to deep. It came now in fits that bent his little body and would not let him sleep. By the day after that, his face was flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. And Della knew. In the part of her body that had known before her mind was willing to say it out loud. She knew. There was no healer within days of hard riding, and the kind of healer who might have helped did not, as a rule, come to a settlement like theirs. There was the medicine her mother had made, from the inner bark of the choke cherry, and a bitter root, and rendered fat with crushed mint, laid warm on a small chest, to draw the wet up out of the lungs. There was the song her uncle could sing, and would sing, and had already begun to ready the small drum for. And there was the house that was not yet built, the pit that was not yet fully dug, the posts and the beams and the willow lattice and the heavy sod, none of it yet standing, and the ground getting harder every hour the cold held. She sat by the fire that night with her son against her chest. She felt his heat come through the robe. Wren slept curled against her hip. Elias, healed enough now to move without the splint biting into him, sat across the low flames, feeding the fire small pieces of wood, so that she would not have to move, and wake the boy. The old man had gone to his own house to prepare, and the settlement outside was quiet. The particular kind of quiet a place falls into when everyone has heard that a child is sick, and no one yet knows whether the sickness will be the kind that ends in a grave on the bluff. She did not weep. She had not wept for her mother, and she would not begin now, with her son's heartbeat still warm against her own. She spoke, instead, quietly, over the top of his head, to Elias, because he was the only grown soul awake in the house, and because, in the space of that hard month, he had become, without either of them naming it, a person she could speak to when there was no one else. "I will dig tomorrow," she said. He looked up. He did not question it. "With him like this," she went on, "with him like this, I will dig tomorrow, because if I do not dig tomorrow, I only dig later. And there is no later that helps him." She looked into the fire. "If he lives in the new house, or in this one. If he does not live, the house is for his sister. Either way, it is dug tomorrow." Elias was quiet a long time. Then he said, and it was the first time he had used her name in that house, and he said it plainly and low, "Della, I cannot dig, not on this leg, but I can measure. I can hold a line. I can keep the pit true while you break the ground, and I can sit with him when you cannot." She did not answer him in words. She only closed her eyes for a moment and let her son's heat pass into her, and let her daughter's weight settle against her side. And she thought that in all her mother's memory of every house that was ever raised in her line, no house had ever been raised over a dying child, and that her mother, if she were sitting at that fire now, would have said the same thing she had just said, and would not have flinched from it either. They began at first light. The way to break frozen ground was with fire. Every woman in her line had known it, further back than anyone could count. You built a small crib of hard wood at the place you meant to dig. You packed it with dry grass. You lit it and let it burn down to embers. The embers thawed the top few inches of the earth. You scraped those inches away with a broad blade fitted to a haft. Then you packed the crib and lit it again, and again, and again. It was slow work. In a warm season, 3 women could dig a house pit in a day and a half. In the worst of the cold, with a daughter who had never done it, an old man whose hip ached in the frost, 2 women from the far side of the settlement who came because their mothers had once helped Della's mother, and a man who could not kneel. It went slower than that. Much slower. But it went. Wren worked without a word of complaint. Her hands blistered by the second morning. They bled by the third. She wrapped them in strips of the soft hide her grandmother had once used to line moccasins, and she went back to the fire and said nothing about the pain. Della watched her without watching her. The way a mother watches a child at a task she has decided the child is now old enough to do. She did not offer to take the blade. Once she caught her daughter's eye across the smoke, and Wren, seeing that she had been seen, did not smile, but she straightened, a fraction, which was the same thing. Elias sat on a low bench, his splinted leg held clear, and he did the one thing he could do. He kept the pit round. He kept it true. He read the depth off a marked stick and called the numbers out in a voice that did not need to be loud, because everyone working the fires was listening for it. A hand's depth, then 2, then 3. And on the 7th day of digging, when the marked sticks said they had reached the depth her mother's memory called for, the earth beneath their feet changed color, from the pale brown of the surface to a darker, wetter brown. A brown that held its warmth even against the wind that came down over the rise. And the old man, who had been silent most of that day, crouched and took a handful of that dark earth and pressed it to his cheek, and did not take his hand away for a long time. That evening, Della came in from the pit to find her uncle waiting for her at the mouth of her house. He had a bundle at his feet. He looked, in the low light, older than she had ever seen him look, and she understood at once that whatever he had come to say was going to ask him to admit something he had not admitted before. He crouched. He unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 4 sections of good wood, each roughly the length of a tall man, each cut clean at both ends, each with a fork worked at one end, in the pattern of a house post. They were the 4 smaller uprights, the ones that would ring the outer edge of the new house and cradle the shorter rafters. Exactly the number she needed. They had been cut, she saw from the marks at their ends, in the warm season, months ago, and stored, wrapped in oiled hide against the damp, somewhere dry. She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching. "You cut these," she said. "I cut these in the summer." A pause. "In the summer before your mother died." "Uncle." Her voice was very quiet. "You told me you dreamed the 4 posts closed their eyes. You told me not to build." He was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice lower than she had ever heard him use, he let both his lives sit side by side at the same fire, the way an old man sometimes does, at the end of a long road. "A daughter of my sister who stops building because her uncle tells her a dream is not the daughter of my sister." He set his hand on the fork of the nearest post. "I needed to know which one you were before I gave you these. I could not know without asking, and I would rather have been wrong about you, and cruel, than right about you," and handed the wood to a woman who would take it, and then break under the first hard wind. He looked up at her. "You did not break. I have my answer. Here is the wood." Della could not speak for a long moment. She had been ready, in that hard month, for many things. She had not been ready to learn that the dream had been a door, that the old man who had stood over her cracked post at the worst hour and had knelt with his hands on the wood, had been testing her the entire time, and had loved her enough to test her, and had cut the 4 posts in advance, so that if she passed, she would not lose a single day to their absence. She sat down on the cold ground beside the bundle. She put her hand on the fork of the nearest post, beside his, and she made a sound in her throat that was almost, but not quite, the thing she would not let herself do. And her uncle did not look away, and did not look at her, and only stayed crouched there beside her until she was ready to stand up again. That night, for the first time in 5 nights, Silas's fever broke. His forehead was cool under her hand near the middle of the night, and his breath, though still wet, came longer. And Wren, sleeping beside him, felt the change through the robe, and opened her eyes, and looked across the fire at her mother, with the first real hope she had let herself feel in a week. Della did not tell her not to hope. She only nodded once, and put another small piece of wood on the fire, and let herself, for the space of one long breath, believe that the winter might, after all, be one she could still win. She should have known better. The wind had been holding its breath, and a wind that holds its breath is only a wind deciding what to do next. The frame went up over the next days. The 4 center posts set deep in the warm, dark earth of the pit. The great beams cradled in their forks. The shorter rafters running out to the 4 posts the old man had cut in the warm season and carried to her wrapped in hide. The willow lattice woven across the span, 3 fingers thick, exactly as the memory said, and the figures agreed. A layer of dried grass laid over the willow. It was a house. Almost. It was a house missing only its last skin, the heavy outer layer of sod. The layer that turns a frame into a home. The layer that holds the grass, so the grass holds the willow, so the willow holds the beam, so the beam holds against anything the sky can send. That sod was cut and stacked in a low mound 30 paces to the east, under hide, waiting for the day she had planned to lay it, which was 3 days off, at least. And on the afternoon before she meant to begin, the sky went the color of old iron in the middle of the day. The old ones had warned that the warm spell would not last, that it sat on the land like a lid on a pot, and that when it lifted, whatever had been building underneath would come all at once. It lifted. The warmth that had made the last days almost bearable drained out of the air in a single afternoon, the way heat drains out of a stone once the fire is gone. And into the space where it had been came something else, something with weight, something with intent. The first snow did not fall. It arrived sideways. It came across the rise where the new house stood, fine and hard and fast, and it did not drift down the way snow is supposed to. It flew, low and level, hissing over the frozen grass, catching on the unfinished frame, packing into the seams of the willow. The wind rose from nothing to a single held note that took the breath of the whole settlement at once. Della stood at the edge of the new house, Elias on one side of her, on the leg that could still carry him, the old man on the other. She looked at the frame, the posts standing, the beams cradled, the willow woven, the grass laid, and no sod, not one block of it on the roof. She looked at the low mound of sod 30 paces east, already going pale under a skin of driving snow, and she did the last reckoning of that season. Without the sod, the grass would tear. Once the grass tore, the willow would lift. Once the willow lifted, the wind would find the beams, and the beams would move. And the 4 posts, however sound, however deep, could not hold a roof whose upper layers had already blown out over the river. The house her son's fever had broken under. the house that was meant to hold her children through every winter still to come, was one hard night away from being scattered across the frozen grass in pieces. She turned to the two men beside her, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Robes," she said. "Every robe in this settlement that can be spared. We lay them over the grass. We weight them at the edges with sod blocks, not the whole roof, just the peak." She looked up at the black shape of the unfinished house against the iron sky. "The wind will strip the edges first. If the peak holds through the night, we lay the rest at first light, in whatever the morning gives us." Elias was already moving toward the old house on the leg that could still move. The old man was already turning toward the eastern row, where every family had heard the wind come up, and every family knew, without being told, whose roof stood open and why. And on the roof of the old house, Wren was already untying the largest of the outer robes, without being told. Silas, who had sat up that very afternoon and eaten a small bowl of corn with his own hands for the first time in a week, was on his platform, wrapped warm, watching his mother with the eyes of a child who has decided that his mother's face is now the only weather that matters. And Della had one clear thought, as she set her hand on the ladder to climb up into the screaming dark. One thought, above the wind. Whatever this night takes from her, it will not take him. Not tonight. She did not yet know that the night had already decided otherwise. The rope she had knotted at the base of the ladder froze against her palm before she reached the second rung. She had wrapped that palm in a strip of soft hide that morning, against exactly this, and the hide was already stiff, and the cold beneath it was already through to the skin. Above her, the peak of the unfinished house was a black shape against a blacker sky, marked only by the paler black of the smoke hole, where no smoke rose, because no fire yet burned inside. The wind hit her broadside as she cleared the eave. It did not push her. It reached under the robe on her shoulder and tried to lift her, the way a hand lifts a page. She flattened herself along the ridge. Below her, on the ladder, came Elias. His splinted leg would not bend at the knee, so he climbed the only way he could, pressing the flat of his boot against each rung and hauling himself up on the strength of the good leg and both arms. He had told her at the bottom that he would come up, because there was no one else to come. And she had not argued, because there was no one else. The old man was gathering robes from the eastern row. Two women were dragging sod blocks from the mound. Wren was working a rope at the corner of the old house, tying a length of it around the outer beam, so that when her mother reached the peak, she would have something to make fast to. Every pair of hands in that settlement that could hold a rope in that wind was already holding one somewhere. Della reached the peak. She lay flat along the ridge of woven willow, on the side away from the wind, and she dragged the robe up after her by its corner. The willow beneath her chest gave a little, in the way she had asked it to give when she chose the weave. It did not tear. She flung the first robe across the smoke hole, so the flat of it lay over the opening, like a cloth laid over a wound. She anchored the near corner with her own knee. She reached back for the second robe. Elias was passing it up the ladder to her, pinning it against his chest with one forearm, shoving it upward with his shoulder. She caught it. She laid it beside the first, overlapping by the width of a hand. She anchored that corner with her elbow, and her other hand was already reaching for the rope. Wren had run the line up to the outer beam. Della looped it twice around the gathered corners of both robes and cinched it. And she felt the tension take, and she felt the roof beneath her decide, for the first time that night, that it was going to hold something. Then the wind found the willow. Along the northern quarter of the roof, where no robe yet lay, she heard the lattice begin to speak. A small, dry rattling, like teeth in a jar. She rolled onto her hip. She looked. The willow was lifting there, 3 fingers at a time, and the dried grass beneath it was already loose in a patch the size of her spread hand. And the patch was growing while she watched. If it reached the width of a forearm, the wind would take the whole northern quarter in a single breath. And there would be no roof to lay sod on in the morning, because there would be no house in the morning. She called down to Elias without turning her head. Sod, 2 blocks, now, onto my back. He did not answer. He did not need to. She heard the ladder creak as he went down it faster than any man with a splinted leg had any business going. And she heard, 40 long breaths later, his boot on the rung again. And she felt the weight of the first sod block slide up onto the small of her back, where she lay. She reached back with one hand and steadied it. And she began to walk the block up the slope of the roof toward the loose patch, using her hip as a pivot, moving it with her whole body an inch at a time. The block weighed, she guessed, as much as a half-grown child. It was frozen solid, which, in that moment, was the only reason it worked at all. Frozen sod does not crumble under the weight of a woman's hip. It slides. It hates to slide. It wants to catch and grip. But it slides. If you keep it moving, and never once let it settle. She kept it moving. She reached the loose patch. She rolled onto her back, took the block in both hands, lifted it, and set it down in one clean motion across the corner of the lifting grass, so that the block's own weight pinned the grass to the willow, and the willow to the rafter, and the rafter through the fork to the beam. The wind screamed, and did not take the patch. It took instead a thin skin of loose grass 3 feet to the west, but it took only that skin, and beneath the skin the second layer of grass held, and above the willow now sat that block of frozen earth, telling the wind the argument was over. On that corner, at least, 2 more blocks, then 2 more. Elias climbed the ladder over and over, and she did not look at him because she could not afford to look at anything but the roof. But she knew from the timing of the weight arriving at her back that he was moving on the bad leg in a way he was going to pay for later, and she knew there was nothing she could say to him about it that would matter. So she said nothing. The old man came up on the 6th trip. He did not use the ladder the way a man uses a ladder. He used it as a rail, holding it with one hand and climbing along the outside curve of the house, finding cracks in the sod with his moccasin toes that she had not known were there until he found them. He carried a coil of rope over one shoulder and a length of woven mat under his arm. He reached the peak. He did not speak. He unrolled the mat across the exposed willow on the eastern quarter. He weighted it with the coil, and then he lay down flat across the coil himself, so that his own old body became, for the next long hour, one of the anchors of the roof. Ren came up an hour after him. Della saw her daughter's head appear at the eave, and she opened her mouth to send her back down. And the words did not come, because the face at the eave in the dark was not the face of a child. It was the face of a woman Della did not yet know. Ren crawled along the ridge, a bundle of hide strips clenched in her teeth, a smaller sod block cradled against her belly. She wedged herself between her mother and the smoke hole, and she began, without a single word of instruction, to lash the corners of the first two robes to the ridgepole where they had started to work loose, working left-handed, because her right hand was holding the block against her body to keep it from sliding away into the dark. Della did not tell her to go down. She reached out once and touched the top of her daughter's head, and then she went back to the work of the roof. They held the peak through the night, not all of it. The northeast quarter opened twice and had to be closed twice, and the second closing cost them the largest robe, which the wind took clean off the roof at some black hour and carried away toward the river in a shape like a great dark bird that had been shot and was falling and flying at the same time. But the ridge held. The smoke hole stayed covered, and the 4 center posts, deep in the warm dark of the pit, felt only what the beams above them chose to pass down. And the beams chose to pass down almost nothing, because the willow held the grass, and the grass held the wind. The house, without its final skin, behaved that night as though it already wore it, because 4 bodies on its ridge stood in for the sod that was not yet laid. And 4 bodies, as it turned out, were enough. At the darkest hour, Elias missed his footing. She heard it more than saw it. She heard the wrong sound of a boot on a rung, a scrape where there should have been a step, and then she heard the ladder itself shift against the eave, and she looked down, and she saw him, at the 3rd rung from the top, one arm hooked over a rung, the splinted leg swinging free below him, his whole weight on the good leg, which was still on the ladder, and which had already begun to shake. The way a leg shakes when it has been working too hard, for too long. He was going to fall. It was not a question of if. It was a question of when the arm gave out. And the arm was going to give out inside a count of 6. She could not reach him from the ridge. She was 15 feet away, along a curve of sod and willow that did not allow fast movement. She could not go down the ladder, because he was on the ladder. She had, at the outside, 6 seconds to solve a problem with 2 answers, and both of them were bad. She chose the worst one. She unhooked the loop of rope from her own waist, the one she had used an hour before to make the corners fast. She threw the free end over the peak of the roof so that it fell down the far side out of the wind, and she took 2 running steps along the ridge toward her uncle, dropped to her knees, and put her whole weight on the rope. As an anchor, the rope ran straight over the peak, down the windward side, past Elias's hooked arm. "The rope!" she called, and her voice came out low, more command than shout. "Not the ladder. Take it. Now." He took it. He did not question. His arm came off the rung, and his hand closed on the rope, and Della felt his full weight arrive on the line, all at once, and she felt the rope try to pull her off the ridge and out into the dark, and she braced her hip against her uncle's coil, and her knee against the mat, and she held. Elias swung once against the wall of the house, hit it with his good shoulder, took the blow, held on, and then, one-handed, he began to walk himself down the leeward side, using the rope as his single line to the ground, letting the splinted leg trail behind him like a thing that no longer belonged to him. When he reached the ground, he lay on his back in the snow for a count of 30 before he rolled onto his knees. And even from the peak, even in the dark, she could see that he was shaking. She did not go down to him. She could not. She turned back to the roof. Her uncle across the ridge was watching her with something in his face she could not read in the dark. And it was only later, near the gray hour, when the wind had begun to fall from its impossible note to a merely terrible one, that he spoke. For the first time in hours. A woman who throws a rope to a stranger in a storm, he said, is a woman who has already decided what he is worth to her. I have not decided. You threw the rope. I threw the rope because he was on my ladder. The old man did not answer that. He looked instead at the eastern edge of the sky, where the smallest amount of gray had begun to bleed into the black, and he said, more quietly, "When the light comes, we lay the rest of the sod, all of it, today. All of it, all of it." He turned his face to her. "Because if the wind comes again tomorrow, we do not have 4 bodies to spend a second time." She nodded, and she looked past his shoulder, at the old house, 30 paces to the north, at the thin thread of smoke still rising from its own smoke hole, at the small shape of her son, visible through the entrance tunnel, because the flap had blown loose in the night, and no one had been able to come down off the roof to fasten it. And she saw at once that her son was not moving. She had been watching him all night, without knowing she was watching him. In the small corner of her attention that had not been on the roof, she had been keeping the count. The robe on his platform had risen and fallen, and risen again, in the rhythm of a small chest, breathing under thick hide. That rhythm had stopped. She could not have said when. She could not have said whether it had stopped in the last hour or the last 3, because she had not been counting, because she had been holding a roof. She was down the ladder before she had decided to move. Her feet did not use the rungs. She used the outside of the ladder, the way her uncle had, dropping in bounds of 4 feet at a time. She hit the ground on both legs together, and neither leg registered it, and she was already crossing the 30 paces to the old house before her uncle had begun to climb down behind her. Wren was already there. Wren, who had come down 5 minutes before her, was on her knees on the earthen floor, her ear against her brother's chest, her hand on his forehead, and she was not crying. She was so still, stiller than Della had ever seen her, and Della understood before her daughter spoke that the stillness was a thing the girl had chosen to put on, because the other thing, the true thing, was a weight an 11-year-old could not carry through the rest of a winter. "Mother," Wren said, in a voice that would never again, in Della's hearing, be the voice of a child. "He is cold." Della knelt. She put her palm on her son's cheek. The cheek was the temperature of the robe. She put her ear where her daughter's ear had been, and she listened. For a long time, for far longer than there was any reason to listen. There was nothing to hear. She did not weep. In the last hours, she had spent every reserve of body a mother possesses. and there was nothing left in her that would answer to it. She sat back on her heels, and she drew the smaller of the two robes up over her son's face, slowly, the way long ago her own mother had once drawn a robe up over her father's face, in this same house, on a gray morning when Della was a small girl herself, a gesture she had watched then, and had not understood the whole weight of, until this moment, when her own hand made it. She smoothed the hide across her son's forehead. She left her hand there. Wren put her head against her mother's side. And at last, the girl made a sound. It was not a large sound. It was the sound a young thing makes when it has been very brave for a very long time, and has run all the way to the end of what bravery is made of. Della put her arm around her daughter and pulled her close, and she felt those small shoulders begin to shake against her ribs. And she held her, and she herself made no sound at all. The old man came in behind her. He saw. He did not speak. He crossed the floor. He knelt on the far side of the platform. He put one hand on the small, still shape beneath the robe, and in a voice so low it was almost not a voice at all, he began to sing, the first of the songs that an old man of that people sings for a child of his sister's line. It was not a song that finished quickly. It was not meant to. It was a song built to give a family time. Time to walk from where they were standing when the child stopped breathing, to where they would need to be standing in order to go on living. He would not finish it for many days. That was the way of the song. Outside, the wind fell at last, not because it was finished with them, only because it had, for now, moved on. The way that kind of wind always does, leaving the world it had emptied exactly as it found it, and nothing like it found it. By the middle of the morning, the sky had gone pale and quiet, and the cold, though still bitter, no longer had teeth in it. And the women of the Eastern Row came, without being sent for. They came to lay the sod. The men who could be spared came with them, and Marta came. Della saw her cousin at the edge of the rise, and she did not look away, and she did not look for long. Marta stood a moment, hands folded, and then she bent and picked up a block of frozen sod and carried it to the roof, and she worked through the whole of that pale afternoon without speaking to Della once, and Della understood that this was not forgiveness. Not on either side. It was the thing that, in a hard place, stands in for forgiveness. When forgiveness costs more than anyone has to spend. A shared piece of labor that both of them agreed, without a word, would count for something. Later, they finished the sod by full dark, and the house stood, sealed, whole, complete. Its 4 center posts carrying the beams, its 4 smaller posts carrying the rafters, its willow holding the grass, its grass holding the sod holding against the sky, and inside, on a small platform on the west wall that Della had built with her own hands out of a bench from the old house, a fire was lit. For the first time in the new house's life, the old man sang the second of his songs while the fire caught, so that his voice for his sister's child would be the very first voice the new house ever learned. The boy was not laid inside the new house. He was carried in the way of his mother's people to a place on the low bluff, wrapped in the smaller robe of his mother's bed, and in the robe that had been his father's, and had lain across his platform every night of his short life. His resting place faced east, so that the first light of every morning would find him before it found the living. And Della stood at the foot of it. She did not climb the little ladder they had leaned against it. She was not permitted to. In the way of her people, the mother did not climb. The mother stood on the earth. The earth was what the mother had left. Her grief, when it came 3 nights later, in the dark, in the new house, when everyone else was asleep, and it came only for the length of one breath, drawn in and let out, and it was silent, and it did not come again. In the morning, the stranger was gone. She knew it before she reached his platform. A house has a way of telling you when it holds one fewer breath than it did the night before. A house built into the earth is close like that. It keeps its count. She crossed to the west wall, and the platform was empty. The robe he had used was folded once, cleanly, at the head of it, and on top of the folded robe sat the leather case. She stood over it a moment before she touched it, because she understood, in the way she had come to understand things that winter, that whatever was inside the case was the last thing the man was ever going to say to her, and that once she opened it, he would be finished saying it. She knelt. She unbuckled the strap. Inside were 2 things. The first was the map, the same oilcloth map, the same fine, careful hand, but the pencil line had changed. The old line, the straight one, the one that had run east to west through her floor, was still there. Faint now, half rubbed away, and beside it ran a new line, a lighter line, sketched in a different hand, running not through the settlement, but wide of it, curving out and around a stretch of ground the stranger had marked in his own small precise notation as unfit, as ground that could not be graded without seasons of extra work, ground no company would ever choose to fight. He had not made the ground unfit. He had only written it so. On the one page the men downriver would ever read, because to those men, the page was the country. And the country was whatever the page said it was. The second thing in the case was the list, only it was not the same list. It had been copied over. By hand, the names were the same names, but the dates beside them had been changed, and beside her own name, and beside the names of the other families of that settlement, a single line had been drawn. And beneath that line, in a different ink, in the stranger's own hand, were words she could not fully read. But she did not need to read them. She understood their weight the way she understood the weight of a roof beam, by what it was holding up. He had written the settlement out of danger, and at the very bottom of the page, he had signed his own name to it, his full name, plainly. So there could be no mistake about who had done this thing, so that no other man could be blamed for it, and no other man could undo it without answering for it. There was no letter. There was no explanation. There was only the map and the list, and one thing more. Tucked beneath them both, a single strip of soft hide, the same color as the strip she had wrapped around her own palm, the night she went up the ladder into the wind. He had cut it from the same hide. He had left it as the only sign she was ever going to receive, that he had understood, in the end, what she had done for him, and what she had not done for him, and what the difference between those two things had been. She sat on the platform for a long time, the case in her lap. She did not open it a second time. She did not need to. She understood, the way she had understood the 4 posts her uncle cut in secret, that she had been handed something whose worth would not be measured on the day she received it, but in the years that came after, and that the man who handed it to her had done so in the only way that would let her keep it, without asking her leave, and without leaving her the burden of having to thank him. He would not come back. She understood that too. A man who signs his own name to a thing that costs his master seasons of work and untold coin does not go back downriver as what he was. He goes back as what he used to be. And if he is fortunate, he is allowed to keep going, east, on the next road out, without anyone stopping him to ask why the line had moved. And if he is not fortunate, then his name goes on to a different kind of list, in a different kind of ledger, and she had no way of knowing which he had been. Not then, not for a long while. When the company man came back, the ice on the river was breaking up. It went out in slabs the size of small houses, and the sound of it reached the settlement at night like a great herd running on frozen ground. Cordell came with only one rider this time. He dismounted at the same spot he had dismounted at before. He looked older than he had in the cold, which was a thing that happened to men in that country when the country was making up its mind about them. He carried a folded paper. He held it out to her without a word. She opened it. It was an order. It said that, in light of a revised survey filed by the company, a survey showing the ground beneath the settlement to be unfit for the road, the removal of her household and the households of her neighbors had been set aside, with no new date named, pending a further look that everyone who wrote such papers knew might never come. She folded the paper along its crease. Her hands did not shake, and that steadiness, after everything the winter had taken, was the closest thing to grief she had left in her to show. She looked up at Cordell. "You knew," she said. "I knew before the ice began to move." His voice was flat, but not unkind. "I was not permitted to tell you. I am permitted now." "Who filed the survey?" He was quiet a moment. Then, carefully, "An engineer of the company, over his own name. The company disputed the filing. The men above the company accepted it, and the engineer is no longer with the company." He let that sit, "but the filing stands." She put the folded order into her sleeve, and she looked at Cordell. And for the first time in all the hard months she had known him, she saw him allow himself something that was almost a smile. It did not reach his mouth, only his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "the change buys this settlement a few years, perhaps more. It does not buy forever. I understand. You will use the time. I will use the time." He mounted, and he rode east along the river trail with his one rider behind him, and she did not watch him out of sight, because she had that morning a great deal else to do. The letter came when the ground had gone soft, and the first green was pushing up along the old riverbed. It was carried up by a trader with a bundle of other things, and it was very short. It said that the man was well, that he had found work, small work, teaching numbers to children in a far town, for a wage that was a small fraction of what he had once earned. And it said one thing more. It said that his leg had healed straight, that he did not limp, and that he laid the credit for it on the willow splint, and the woman who had set the bone without softness, because softness would have cost him more later. The letter did not ask her anything. It did not offer her anything. It closed with a single line, that he did not need to be answered, that he had only needed her to know. The leg had healed straight. She read it once, and then she folded it along its own crease, and she put it in a small wooden box beneath her sleeping platform. She did not answer it, but she kept it. And in the years that followed, she took it out twice each year. On the morning her son had been laid on the bluff, and on the morning her mother had died. She did not read it on other days. She did not need to. She used the time. That was the thing she did with it, not the thing a lesser woman might have done, which was to sit inside the reprieve and be grateful for it and wait to see how long it lasted. She did not wait. In the first warm season, she taught the making of a house, not to one girl, to 4, her own daughter, and 3 others of the settlement whose mothers sent them to her because the word had gone out quietly, the way true words go out, that the widow on the rise knew a thing worth knowing, a thing that had held a roof through a night that should have taken it. She did not teach it by talking. She taught it by putting her hands on their hands. She had them tie the strips of cloth on the chosen trees. She had them feel the ground in 9 places for the one spot that was warm. She had them cut and dig and weave and lift. And by the end of that season, 2 of the 4 girls had raised small houses of their own, one for her family, one for her aunt. And Della stood at the raising of both, and she did not sing. She only watched, because the songs were not hers to sing at another woman's roof. The songs belonged to the woman whose hands had done the building. That was the whole point of teaching, not to make the girls into copies of her, but to make them into women who would one day stand on their own roofs and sing in their own voices. A song she had only handed them the shape of. The years turned, the way years do. The old man went quietly in his own home one season when a sickness came up the river. His sister's daughter was beside him at the end. He sang no song for himself, which Della understood to mean he had made his own arrangement with what was coming. She laid him on the bluff beside her mother, and carved the mark of the 4 directions into good wood, and set it at both their heads. She did not add a mark for her son, because her son already had one, and by then it had gone weather-worn and pale, and had begun to look less like a thing that human hands had made, and more like a piece of the country itself, which was how a resting place on that bluff was meant to look, in the end. And the reprieve the stranger bought did not last forever. He had said as much in his silence. Cordell had said as much out loud. A few years, not forever. And when the order came again, a new order, on new paper, with new names above it, she did not fight it the same way. Because by then, the thing she was protecting was no longer a single house on a rise. It was the knowing, and the knowing does not live in a house. It lives in the hands you have put your hands on top of. The new house, the one she built in the killing winter, the one 4 bodies had held through the dark, was left standing when the families finally moved on. It was not torn down. For reasons of their own, The men who moved them decided it was cheaper to leave the earth houses where they stood than to take the trouble of unmaking them. And so it was left. And in it, Della left 3 things. She left the 4 strips of faded cloth, wound around the base of the east post. She left the woven mat that had held the sod through the worst of the night, folded on the platform. And in the small pit in the southeast corner, the one that had once hidden a man, the one no searcher had ever found, she left the single strip of soft hide, the one the stranger had cut from the same skin as hers. She packed it in a fold of charred wood dust, the way her people had always packed a thing they meant the earth to keep. She did not tell her daughter it was there. She only knew herself that it was. And that was enough. She lived a long life after that. Longer than her mother had. Longer than she had once expected to. And she taught her granddaughter, born into a world already half changed, to grind corn on a flat stone. In the rhythm her own grandmother had taught her. Back and forth. Stone on stone, the same motion, going back further than the child could count. And when the girl was old enough, she taught her the other thing too, how to press a palm flat to the earth in 9 places on a rise, and feel for the one that was warm. The girl asked her once why it mattered. There were no earth houses anymore. There was nothing to build. Why learn to feel for warm ground when no one would ever again dig a floor into it? And Della was quiet for a moment. And then she said the thing that the girl would carry for the rest of her life, without fully understanding, until she was old herself, why it had gone so deep. You do not learn it to use it, she said. You learn it so it does not die with the last woman who knew it. A thing that only one person knows is already half gone. A thing that 2 people know can wait. It can wait a long time. It can wait for a winter when someone needs it again. And someone always needs it again. The girl did not understand it. Not then. But she remembered it, which was all Della had asked. Wren, the girl who had climbed a roof in a killing wind at 11 years old and had held her dying brother in her arms and had chosen stillness over breaking, grew into a woman of quiet weight in that country. She lived a long time, long enough to see roads come and go and come again. And near the end of her own long life, she told the story to her own granddaughter, not as a great tale of a wind and a roof, but as a small thing, a true feeling thing, in the way of the best invented stories, which carry a truth that never needed to have happened to be true. She told it as the story of a woman who was told, by everyone she trusted, that the thing could not be done. By her uncle, who dreamed it should not. By her cousin, who hoped it would not. By the men downriver, who were certain it made no difference whether it did, and who did it anyway. Not because she was certain she would win, but because the alternative was to hand her children a smaller world than the one her mother had handed her. And a woman does not do that. A woman does not stop building because the ground is hard. The house stood empty on its rise for many years, and then, in a hard season, one of the beams gave way, and the northern quarter of the roof came down in a single fall of sod and grass and willow, and the rest followed within the year. And the 4 center posts, deep in the old warm earth, rotted at last at the base, and fell inward across the pit that had held them, until there was nothing left on that rise, but a shallow, round hollow in the ground, a little wider than a house, that, in certain lights, at certain hours of the morning, looked exactly like what it was. The memory a piece of country keeps of a house that was built for it, and by it, and out of it. And that returned to it, when its work was done. Long after, the strip of soft hide was found, not by a daughter, not by any hand that knew what it was. It was found by strangers, digging carefully in the round hollow on the rise, mapping the marks where 4 posts had once stood, and the 2 old storage pits. And in the southeast pit, preserved by the charred dust packed around it, and by the deep cold of the ground that had kept it as faithfully as it had once kept a hidden man alive, they found a single strip of soft hide, worn smooth on one side by long contact with a human palm. They did not know what it was. They wrote, in their careful notes, that it appeared to have been placed there on purpose, wrapped and packed with care, though for what purpose, they could not say. They boxed it and carried it away, and it rests now in a quiet place, in a small box, with a number written on the side. It is not looked at often. There is nothing about it, to a stranger's eye, that would seem to be worth looking at. It is only a strip of soft hide, worn smooth on one side. But a strip of hide, worn smooth on one side, is a strip of hide that a hand held, again and again, over years. And a thing a hand holds, over years, is never only a thing. The wind still comes down, in the last hard week of the cold season, over that country. It still crosses the open grass without slowing. And on the rise where the settlement once stood, there is grass now, and a few wild plums in the warm months. And there is, in the shallow, round hollow that marks where a woman once built a house in a killing winter, a slight warmth to the earth in the early morning, even in the coldest weeks, that the people who own that land now have noticed, and have never quite been able to explain. One of them, a girl of 11, said once to her grandmother that it felt, when she put her hand against it, as if something down there was still breathing. And her grandmother did not correct her. She only said, in a voice the girl would remember for the rest of her life, without fully knowing why, "The ground beneath your feet is not just a foundation. It is a partner. And a partner remembers you long after you have stopped remembering yourself." The girl went back the next morning at first light, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold earth, and she held it there until her hand ached, and then a little longer, because she had understood, without being told, that some kinds of listening ask the listener to give something first, and that a small ache in the hand was a fair price for what she was being allowed to hear. What she was allowed to hear was not a voice. It was closer to the memory of a rhythm, the steady rhythm of a stone turning on a stone, of corn becoming meal, of a woman's shoulders moving in the way her mother's had moved, and her grandmother's before that, going back further than the girl could count, going back to a winter when a woman put her palm against a piece of wood and decided, without saying it to anyone, that her line was going to hold for one more generation, whatever the wind did. The wind that morning did not answer, but the ground beneath the girl's hand was warm.